All right, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to see all of you here. My name is Will Inboden. I'm a professor here at UT at the LBJ School, and also honored to be the executive director of the Clements Center for National Security, one of your co-sponsors today. And you'll soon, in a moment, be hearing from my friend, partner, and co-conspirator, Bobby Chesney with the Strauss Center. So just a very brief welcome and introduction, and why are we gathered here today with this particular theme? Well, this is our second annual National Security Forum, following on the inaugural one last year. And last year, one of the plenary sessions featured Director of National Intelligence Jim Clapper, and he was talking, he made some very compelling comments about what he regarded in his over 50 years of intelligence work as the unprecedented complexity of the threat environment that he was facing. Everything from transnational non-state actors such as terrorists to the rise of new great power peer competitors or potential peer competitors such as China and Russia, to entirely new domains such as cyber. And then he also, in particular, talked about his concerns about us potentially underestimating the threat from the Islamic State, from ISIS. And so, pivoting off those comments from a year ago, that's when we started planning this year's conference, and we decided to take Director Clapper's insights and concerns as our theme, which, as you'll know now, is Great Powers, Failed States, and New Frontiers, National Security Challenges in the 21st Century. Consistent with our belief in the importance of bringing all instruments of national power and insight to bear on these questions, we've tried to structure each panel not just around an interesting topic, but with people with varying professional backgrounds. And so each panel will have a senior military officer, active duty or retired, senior intelligence official, a senior policymaker, and then a scholar. And some of the panelists will actually have inhabited 3 or 4 of those hats simultaneously. So it's a very talented group. And then we'll have some plenary addresses from our Chancellor, Admiral McRaven, as well as from 3 leading figures in Congress on these issues. And so we're really trying to engage with a range of disciplines, a range of professional backgrounds, tackling these problems from many different vantage points. So I'll turn it over now to Bobby, who will tell you a little bit about the many co-sponsors who brought us together here today.
Thank you, Will, and thanks to all of you for being here. If my speech sounds a little slurred, I assure you it's not that I was at the bar. I had an unexpected trip to the dentist this afternoon to fix a crown, and as they tend to do, they did numb my jaw. I said, if I'm about to open a conference, I'm going to speak live in front of these people and record it for posterity. He said, well, you know, bring a handkerchief in case you start drooling from the podium. I hope it's all, you know, improved and fair sailing from here. In all seriousness, I want to echo all the things that Will said about the way in which the campus here at UT is pulling together for the study of and engagement with these incredibly important issues. And as a further sign of it, it's not just that the Clements Center and the Strauss Center and the Intelligence Studies Project, which is our joint venture, are involved. There are many other parts of the campus supporting this effort as well. And I would have to begin that list by saying that the President, Greg Fenves, our Chancellor, Bill McRaven, the leadership comes from the top, but other examples of support comes from our co-sponsors, the Alexander Hamilton Society, the Center for East Asian Studies, the Center for Politics and Governance, the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, the Department of Government, the International Affairs Society, the International Relations and Global Studies Program, the LBJ School of Public Affairs, and the Student Veteran Association. As to which you're probably thinking, wow, the university has a lot of centers. This is true, but this is a good thing, and it's a sign of the university's growing engagement with these issues that are so important in our times. But you're not here to hear the list of sponsors. You're here to hear from the experts we've convened. And for our first session, to talk about Russia, we have an outstanding panel that our moderator will introduce. But someone needs to introduce him, and I'm happy to do it. Rob Moser, in addition to being a friend and colleague, Dr. Rob Moser, is the chair of the Department of Government and one of the leading scholars of Russia, its electoral politics, really Eastern Europe and the former Soviet bloc more generally. He's the ideal person and another example of the expertise that resides here on campus. So Rob, I will now turn it over to you. Thanks for doing this.
Great, thanks. So, as moderator, my job here is to introduce our fine panel, an illustrious group of practitioners and scholars to discuss my favorite topic, which is Russia and what the heck is going on with that. As moderator, I will keep the time for our participants. We'll sort of moderate the questions from the crowd, and I do get to ask the first question. And so, just letting you know now, in case you think I'm stealing the stage after the presentations. So, to get this show on the road, let me start by introducing our panelists. We have here going down the table Leon Aron, who is a resident scholar of the American Enterprise Institute and has written numerous excellent books on Russia, its leadership, including Boris Yeltsin, and politics in that region. We have Paula Dobriansky, who is a former Undersecretary of State for Democracy and Global Affairs, and she is currently a senior fellow at the Belfer Center at Harvard. We have General Montgomery Meigs, who is the former commander of U.S. Army Europe. And finally, we have Brigadier General Kevin Ryan, who is currently the Director of Defense and Intelligence Programs at the Belfer Center at Harvard. So thank you all for coming for this panel. Now, each of you will have a chance to give introductory remarks that last up to 12 minutes. And then we will move on into questions from the moderator and then the crowd. So,
well, thank you very much, Professor Moser. You've given us a fairly unambiguous brief. I've rehearsed it until I got it down to 12 minutes, and minus this introduction. So,
that's right. Go ahead and start.
Okay. I will do just that. I will provide an introduction in the hope of whetting your appetite for more detail and dealing with it in the discussion portion of this panel. So what I will try to do is to kind of decode and therefore anticipate Putin's foreign policy in the same way we would proceed with explaining foreign policy of any other national political regime, from the core beliefs to strategy to tactics to policies. And I will conclude on what this analysis suggests by way of trying to modify Russia's foreign policy, Russia's behavior, in a more predictable and less dangerous way. So here are the four things that Vladimir Putin believes. How sincerely he believes, to what extent, doesn't matter. What matters is the policy outcome. First, Russia is never wrong, but perennially wronged, primarily by the West. He follows here his favorite philosopher, Ivan Ilyin, and he believes with Ilyin that the West's hostility to Russia to be internal, prompted by the West's jealousy of Russia's size, natural riches, and most of all of its incorruptible, saintly soul and a God-given mission to be the third Rome and the light among the nations. Plots against Russia are relentless, and while truces are possible and often tactically advantageous, genuine peace with the West is very unlikely. Tenet number two, the end of the Cold War was Russia's equivalent of the Versailles Treaty for Germany after World War I. That is the source of endless humiliation and misery. Tenet number three, the collapse of the Soviet Union was, in Putin's infamous words, the greatest geostrategic tragedy of the 20th century. And it all comes down to tenet number four, which is a policy tenet emerging from the previous three. The overarching strategic agenda of any truly patriotic Russian leader is to recover and repossess political, economic, and geostrategic assets lost by the Soviet state at the end of the Soviet Union. A few years back in an article in Foreign Affairs, I called it the Putin Doctrine. He followed it, he has followed it from virtually day one, and he continues to follow it, as I will illustrate. So, by the time he left the presidency after his first two terms in 2009 for the place holding by Dmitry Medvedev, he largely implemented the domestic side of the Putin Doctrine. National politics, media, especially television, The commanding heights of the economy, the courts, were again owned or controlled by the state. These assets were recovered. When he came back to his third presidency in 2012, he turned to the recovery of geostrategic assets via an activist foreign policy. Why? There were three reasons. First of all, there was a defense modernization, to which Putin in 2008, when he announced it, allocated 22 trillion rubles, or $700 billion in net money in 2008. And although a great deal, as we know, was stolen and misappropriated, 4 years later, in 2012, there were some already fairly well modernized and battle-ready detachments of the Russian army that were recovering from the pretty disastrous war in Georgia in 2008. And most of all, several generations of intercontinental strategic missiles were put in use and tested, and that is something that Putin always considers the core of Russia's military strength. Secondly, Putin has sensed a widening window of opportunity in the West, both in the United States and in Europe, feeling that the leadership, the elites, were distracted, uninterested in foreign policy, preoccupied with their own domestic agendas, and increasingly isolationists. But most importantly, the turn to the activist foreign policy for Putin was due to an emergence, and rather sudden, I think, to him, of a powerful domestic political imperative. When Putin came back to power for his third term in 2012, he, in many respects, came back to a different country. The country that grew 7–8%, and in terms of real incomes about 10% a year between 2000 and 2008, was barely eking out 1.5% of economic growth. And the reason for that, as everybody inside and outside the government, including Putin's confidant, a man who actually brought him from St. Petersburg to Moscow, foreign Minister of Finance and former Deputy Prime Minister Alexei Kudrin, he put it like this. He said Russia had hit an institutional wall, meaning the investment climate became so toxic for the reasons that you all know, and if you have a need for a description, I'll be happy to give it later, that even with the oil prices returning in 2012 to a historic high of about $100 a barrel and more, the Russian economy was slowing down to a creep. Russia was in need of an institutional reform. This is what in politics, but also, of course, in economy. And again, I could outline what Putin was advised on that. But Putin decided not to go that way because he remembered what happened to Gorbachev. Again, his sort of bête noire, his bugbear, and the man he despises for destroying the Soviet Union. And so Putin made what I think is the most fateful decision of his political life. That is, when he rejected an institutional reform to improve the investment climate in Russia, he shifted the basis of legitimacy of his regime from a steady economic growth and steady growth of income to patriotic mobilization. It didn't occur right away. There were all kinds of signs, both in terms of media direction and in terms of behavior of the elites. And again, we could discuss the details later. Bottom line, that switch did occur. And that switch is responsible for much of what we're seeing today. The new policy rested on two propaganda pillars, and by then, as I said, Putin has essentially created a monopolistic propaganda field, especially as far as the television is concerned, where 95% of Russians take their news. One pillar, Russia is rising from its knees, and because of that, the West declared a war on it. The Russian wits have been saying for quite a while that America is at war with Russia, except it doesn't know it. If you look at propaganda, if you look at Putin calling Ukraine NATO's foreign legion, the general direction is that the war has started. The war has started with the CIA-inspired revolution in Ukraine, and we are continuing to be in a sort of low to moderate intensity conflict with the West, primarily the United States. Pillar 2. Although Russia is threatened on all sides by its implacable enemies, it is somehow recovering the Soviet Union status of being feared and therefore respected again. And on the national television, again, where the overwhelming majority of the Russians take their news, foreign policy became a mesmerizing kaleidoscope of breathtaking initiatives and brilliant successes. So how long, let me just give you one example of how some of my favorite independent Russian analysts describe it. You all heard about Putin's astronomical popularity ratings. And we can talk about, what part of it is just the effectiveness of a monopolistic propaganda. As my friend Garry Kasparov says, if you have one restaurant in town, close down all other restaurants and prohibit people from cooking at home, the only dish that is served in the only restaurant will eventually be extremely popular. So that is one issue, but it's deeper than that. When Putin hit on something that we, the analysts, and also our colleagues and some of our close friends among the revolutionary pro-democrat generation of the late 1980s, early 1990s, did not anticipate. And that is the depth and the pain and the hurt of the trauma of losing a special status that most Russians ascribe to their country, right or wrong. The special status of a counterweight to the United States, a special status of a country that carries a banner of something else. And as I said, when people are asked, what do you think of Putin, or do you approve of him? This is not a question anymore about a politician. It is a question of whether you approve of this new, brilliant, and exciting path for Russia, whether you approve of the, as one of the Russian analysts put it, deep righteousness against background of everyone else being wrong and being on the right side in the battle with evil and darkness. Whether they're right or wrong is a different matter. As my teacher at Columbia, the great American sociologist Robert Merton used to say, when people perceive things as real, they're real in their consequences. And that is what we're witnessing. So are there limits to the success of this patriotic mobilization, which has been impressive? Well, Putin has saddled a tiger, and he made it trot very nicely in the direction that he needed. At the time of as the Russian economy is experiencing hardships, he made the people anticipate, and he made the people accept those hardships as bearable, and perhaps even as a badge of honor, given what their country is trying to accomplish and how it's trying to defend itself. Now, the problem with trotting, with sitting on the tiger, is that the tiger requires more and more meat, and it requires meat the more the bloodier. And the bloodier the better. Now, there is a fairly unambiguous history to Russia in the past century and a half, which is that some of the sharpest regime changes have occurred following foreign policy and military setbacks. Remember, the great liberal reforms of Alexander II occurred after the defeat in the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856. The 1905 revolution occurred after Russia's defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, 1903-1905. The Bolshevik Revolution, of course, occurred during a very tough setbacks for Russia in World War I. The Cuban Missile Crisis resulted in the ouster of Nikita Khrushchev. And of course, Gorbachev's perestroika, not entirely, but in a large measure, was prompted by the quagmire that the Soviet Union got itself in Afghanistan. So, and here in conclusion, is there a way in which, if this analysis is correct, is there a way to try and modify Russia's behavior in the direction that we would consider more benign and less dangerous? Yes. Given this history, which Putin knows very well, the thrust, I think, of the policy should be to increase the domestic political costs of his foreign policy. In other words, to reverse this dynamic in which the foreign policy of Russia, from being the centerpiece of legitimacy and pride, becomes a problematic area, an area of embarrassment, and perhaps an area of doubt and regret. There are very concrete steps that could be taken in that direction, but I'll leave them to the discussion part of this panel.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so we'll move on to Paula.
Okay, thank you. Well, good afternoon. I'd like to thank both the Clements and Strauss Centers and Will and Robert, or Bobby, as you like to go by. Thank you very, very much for bringing us here, and it's very timely. You know, the title of the conference series is Great Powers, Failed States, New Frontiers, National Security Challenges in the 21st Century. I'd start right off in focusing on Russia, that Putin's Russia poses a major threat to U.S. interests and ranks near the top of the foreign policy and national security challenges confronting the United States. In fact, the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has categorized Russia as being an existential threat. Not since World War II was Europe faced with a graver crisis. Putin's regime does pose multiple threats, and let me break down those threats and then go into some of the reasons that Putin is doing what he's doing. First, I'd start with Putin and the policies pursued by Putin's regime poses a threat to its own citizens. When you track what's happening domestically, in terms of political freedoms, the political freedoms have deteriorated substantially. One sector, to give as an example, that of the journalists, many journalists have lost their lives during Putin's time. Not only do you have a threat posed internally to the population, but also to the neighbors. You look at the cyber attack on Estonia in 2007. You look at also the attack and aggression on Georgia, 2008. And then no less right up to the present with the illegal annexation of Crimea, as well as the aggression into eastern Ukraine. It's not only on its neighbors, but also broadening this in terms of a threat for the West and also for the United States. Here, particularly what undergirds the threat is not only the stated anti-Americanism, but actually the challenge to our very values, to our alliances, as well as our institutions, even to what I would define as the international liberal order as we know it post-World War II and post-Cold War. You can see very graphic examples of this. It isn't only about a protocol or two, it goes beyond that. But let me give as one example, the Budapest Memorandum, many of you know, was in fact an agreement that the United States, Russia, the UK came together on, and Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal in return for its protection of its territorial integrity and its sovereignty. Well, that has been abrogated clearly by the aggression in not only in Crimea, but also in eastern Ukraine. And what it does is it not only is the actual abrogation of the protocol in of itself, but it has global consequences. It sends signals to those countries like Iran, as well as North Korea, in thinking that, well, these kinds of agreements, they were not upheld. But there's a second, and the second is actually this broader point about those kinds of instruments that comprised what maintained peace and security post-Cold War. When you abrogate one and you actually undertake action that calls these into questions, well, it really cuts at the very heart of the framework and the system that has held peace, security, and stability. So what is this all about? Well, I too would define Putin's, if you will, his view or vision as that of a Putin doctrine, or another word that I'd use is Putinism. And the Putinism is basically what we're witnessing is is not what I would define as the ideology of the Cold War. When you think back on the terms of the Cold War and the definition, you had, communism as an ideology, which was more of a collective ideology versus a very purely personal one. And in this case, you also had that versus democratic societies grounded in freedoms. Here we are witnessing a kind of ideology, and I use that loosely, an ideology that's vertical, it's vested in Putin's power, and basically what really is motivating it is the desire to sustain and aggrandize his power base at all costs. In stepping back, when you look at what were the beginnings of Putin's enunciating this kind of vision. First, in 2007, at the Munich Security Conference, he previewed some of his goals at that time. They were later really enunciated and repeated in his March 18 Duma speech, which was used as justification for the illegal annexation of Crimea. Such concepts as, we don't identify with Western values, that we do have an absolute right to protect Russians wherever they may in fact be. He also started talking about the establishment of a customs union, and also, as was mentioned by Leon, very graphically has mentioned and stated specifically his discontent with the loss of the Soviet Union. In fact, something that Leon discovered, and I remember from a conversation that we had when he was looking through Russian press and when Putin gave his March 18 speech. In Russian press, there were articles that cast his speech as the Fulton speech. That was interesting to me because, of course, going back to Churchill's Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri, that the Russians were categorizing what Putin, in fact, was doing along these particular lines, drawing a line between Russia and the West in this case. So what is all of this grounded in? It definitively is grounded in domestic considerations. I have to agree wholeheartedly with Leon's point on that what we're witnessing as foreign policy aggression and the various foreign policy acts are really grounded in these domestic considerations. In particular, the fact that the Russian economy is in shambles. The ruble and the value of the ruble is in half. Capital flight of 2014 alone was over $150 billion. And I too had the benefit of just earlier this year hearing actually the former finance minister, Alexei Kudrin, talk about the lack of these reforms and that how he had advised Putin to undertake these reforms. There's been no modernization of the economy, and there's been no reform plan. Kudrin has predicted stagnation in the time ahead, and that the consequences of not undertaking those reforms would lead to a continued spiraling down of the economy. So when you look at Putin's actions, for example, vis-a-vis Ukraine, well, Ukraine and what was happening in Ukraine was quite threatening. Ukraine and the demonstrations on the Maidan, this was about actually coming together with the EU and the West, having an association with the European Union, and trying to bolster Ukraine's economy. As you can imagine, having a strong, economically viable economy in Ukraine would be a direct threat to Russia because it has not modernized and because the basis of what we're witnessing in Russia is founded on corruption. But there's a second, and I would say is that his foreign policy activism is clearly rooted in preserving his own power base. The kind of anti-Americanism, the kind of actions that we're seeing right now in the Middle East. It's showing we are a great power. We are the ones who are acting in the Middle East, and the United States is over to the side. It's not leading, it's not engaged, but we are. These are the kinds of messages that are playing at home, which contribute to this nationalism and the kind of nationalism that Putin has been striving to foment. So let me come to the last piece, and that is, well, what to do about it. I would agree wholeheartedly with the point that the way of impacting Putin and bringing about a change is the costs have to be higher than they are. Because at present, he hasn't shifted his course of action. One, because there have been opportunities afforded to him. There have been vacuums of power of which he's been able to fulfill. And thirdly, the cost has not been high. So what would contribute to the cost? First, I would want to see the United States to be part of the diplomatic process in Europe, the Minsk process. We're not at the table. We should be at the table. Secondly, sanctions. The sanctions, there is a sanctions policy, but a number of the sanctions have been very reactive. They're targeted, but not targeted in ways in which they have a systemic impact. And in this case, two examples, one very, I would say, very extreme, which is impacting SWIFT, which goes to the heart of the financial system and Russia's reliance on the financial system. You know it matters when Medvedev said, you influence SWIFT and cut SWIFT, it's a declaration of war. But let me give you one that is very doable. The United States and the Western countries, a number, but we in particular, do provide a great deal of assistance to Russia in refurbishing their antiquated oil refineries. This is one of the areas that we can actually have a great impact, and there would be a cost because that's what the economy relies on. As you know, its energy sector. Two more points, or three more points. Ukraine matters. What we do vis-a-vis Ukraine, economically, providing military and lethal assistance, and thirdly, also helping them in a humanitarian context. Why? Because if Ukraine does not get through this, then again, it doesn't provide the kind of costs that will divert Putin's actions. I would also say that it's crucial during this period to reach out to reform-minded individuals and opposition in Russia. And also there's the issue of NATO defenses. Poland is going to be holding the Warsaw NATO summit next year. Already the new president of Poland has announced formally that they will put forward the need to have permanent forward deployed troops in Poland and in the Baltic states. As you may know, that isn't the case. In fact, that's something that we had agreed to with Gorbachev, that there would not be this permanent forward deployed troops. And finally, we must counter the kind of propaganda, the disinformation that really just is pervasive throughout Europe, throughout many, many different areas, and which has not been countered, but has been left standing. So a multifaceted strategy and really going to the heart of what matters in terms of a specific cost for Putin, I think can actually change Russian behavior.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, General.
Well, that was fascinating, and I have a thought to add to it, but it's sort of in a different direction. Can we use our advantage economically to raise the cost? Yes. Can circumstances come about to where the dollar is no longer the international reserve currency? And you can make a pretty good case that some of the things Putin is doing are aimed directly at that. And I don't think many of us here understand the exact benefit of having the reserve currency as the internet, as your own currency, and what that does for you. It means that bankers are happy to buy treasury bonds at these low interest rates. What happens when the interest rates start to go up on the international market is the value of the bonds go down even lower. You get enough of that going on, and eventually people are more than happy to trade oil or francs or pounds for oil, not dollars. Now, I'm not an economist, and I just started reading into this, but one of the things you have to watch out for, and I realize that as you go into some new sources, and if it's emotionally written, it may be a little over the edge. So, where's the corrective line in this? Some of you are better at that than I am, but clearly, the single most important thing we could do to prevent that loss of status as reserve currency is to manage the growth of our national, not federal, national debt, so that the GDP was never less than the accrual of debt. That's the starting point. But when you put that mark in the sand to international money managers, investment houses, and countries, they see that and know exactly what it means. So one of the remedial efforts that I would recommend, and I'm not an economist, so I can't write the paper, is if there's a loophole in our well-being as a nation, as dire as that is, or could be, we clearly need to have a way of explaining to the American people that, look, if we don't get the relative growth of debt compared to relative growth in GDP sorted out, it's going to really be ugly. That's just the first thing. The second thing is, we used to have forces stationed in Europe. And I remember talking with people in the George W. Bush administration about, don't tear up U.S. Army Europe, you're going to need it someday. Well, it's gone. There's just a vestige left behind. And I can tell you that getting to anything that looks like a front line from Germany on trains takes a heck of a lot less time than bringing them from the United States on ships, which is where we are right now. So we lost the credibility of a proximate force able to mess up anything that the Russians chose to do operationally, which takes me to a third point. We are in a very dangerous game here, and we have to play smart ball. We cannot let our national emotional preferences get in the way of hard thinking. And we have an election to go through. And basically, our way of doing that in the United States is to get naked and jump in the bath, in the whirlpool bath and see what happens. And the rule ought to be, no, you can't do that. You got to wear your boxer shorts. Because if you look at where we are in the process of the election today, name me one candidate, damning them all, that has the experience and the hide and the very cagey calculation system for his decisions or hers. I mean, how many do we, in each party, do we have that can walk into the office and not be there for the, a scrimmage as opposed to the real game? That's going to be a real problem if we don't get that right as a people. And something about Putin the man. I'm not an expert in martial arts. I know a little bit about it. This guy's got an 8th degree black belt in jiu-jitsu, and he's the big guy, so maybe they gave him the belt, whatever. I don't know that happened, but we know human nature. And he fought an international champion jiu-jitsu guy and used Brazilian martial arts to beat the guy. This guy has tremendous physical, mental endurance. He's very determined. And he has a cadre of helpers around him who are extremely loyal. Because if you disagree with him in public, you lose your $10 billion hoard you got when you signed on as a former member of the KGB to be one of the people right around the throne. So they're all on the team. No, there's nobody that's not on the team in the leadership shop in the Kremlin. That's very dangerous, because when you talk about people who are happy no matter what the policy is, as long as they're carrying the flag internationally, it's real easy to get that truck to go over the bank. And it is also clear that the Russians have been on a binge of buying new strategic capabilities, as have the Chinese. It is also clear that Putin has been reaching out to China, and he has been doing everything he can to establish, the physical requirements for a great nation. And again, we have to try to deal with that. Remember when the Russian planes first came down, they flew 2 flights of aircraft over Turkey, remember that? And the Turks, that was a huge sign that they really don't care about the rules. You just don't do stuff like that with a combat-laden airplane. So again, when we're playing this game with Putin, we've got to be very sure we know when he made a mistake inadvertently or intentionally, and govern our reaction based on that from, old Texas-style logic. I'll give you an example. I watched my brother-in-law go around and work land issues, and he always has a visit. And there's certain rules in a visit. You don't talk about some of the later parts of the deal. You establish a relationship. And then at some other point, when the deal is about to go through, then you can have a meeting. And we have to make sure that none of our meetings with Putin are thought to be visits. I think I'm out of time.
I think so. Well, thanks very much. Brigadier General?
Well, thank you. I want to add my thanks to the Clements and Robert Strauss Centers for putting this conference on. It's already a success, I think. And at a recent meeting of U.S. and Russian generals to discuss the way forward on U.S.-Russia relations, the lead Russian general started the session with an anecdote. He said, the collective farm leader called all the workers together. And he said, comrades, for a long time now, we have stood at the precipice. But today, we take a step forward. I think his point was we need to be careful about the next step. I hope. I'm going to do a little bit of reading so I can get through this in my timed 12 minutes here. I was asked to speak to the question about is Russia a threat to the United States? I thought it was a trick question, so I did what we do out east when we get a question we think is hard. I'll answer a different question instead. So the first question I'll answer is Russia more of a threat today to the United States than it was, say, 10 or 15 years ago? And I say the answer to that is probably yes, because it has a greater military capability, and it has a hostile intent toward us. And of course, a threat, right, is a hostile. A threat is made up of intent and capability, the two components. So yes, 10 or 15 years. Is Russia more of a threat today to the United States than it was, say, 25 or 30 years ago? And I would say my guess is no, that it's not. That those intent and capabilities back in the Cold War were far greater than what we see today from Russia. Looked at another way, I could say that what Russia is doing in the Ukraine today, it definitely affects and threatens U.S. interests there, but it does not threaten a war with the United States, primarily because the U.S. has made it clear it won't go to war over Ukraine. What Russia might do in the Baltics, though, would threaten U.S. interests, and more important than this, could drag the U.S. into a war. Similarly, a NATO-Russia clash along the Turkey border, the one maybe similar to what General Meigs just described, could drag the U.S. into war. So these are the kinds of threats that a group called the ELBA Group is concerned about. Let me tell you a little bit about the group and the insights that this group provides to us. And then I'll close by telling you what I think the major threat is to the United States today and what we should do to minimize it. So for the past 5 years, a small but high-level group of retired U.S. and Russian intelligence and military officers have been meeting to discuss sensitive U.S.-Russia relations. Our 7th and most recent meeting was at the end of October, just a month ago, and the group's called the ELBA Group, named after the meeting on the Elbe River at the end of World War II. 3- and 4-star former heads of the GRU, DIA, and FSB are on the group. It includes officers from CIA, Ministry of Interior, and U.S. military. The group meets in third countries because some of the members cannot or will not travel to each other's country. So what do these men have in common? They're not academics, they're not diplomats looking for a reset. They're hard-nosed patriots looking for security for their country. They're former architects of wars in Chechnya, Georgia, Ukraine, Afghanistan, and Iraq. They've run some of the biggest intelligence agencies in the world, and over the past 5 years, they've developed the trust and respect within that group, that small group, necessary to debate some of the most sensitive issues of the U.S.-Russian relationship. So what have they told us about threats and interests? First and foremost, one can group the U.S.-Russia bilateral issues, security issues, in the post-Cold War era in two baskets: the underlying strategic problems and the urgent tactical problems. The underlying strategic problems between the U.S. and Russia include things like NATO-Russia relationship, missile defense, pro-democracy movements, spheres of influence, etc. Those remain largely unresolved. A sense of urgency about these issues has never been present in the United States, but it has been steadily building within the Russian Federation. The tactical issues, things like Russian military operations along NATO borders, Ukraine, Syria, INF treaty violations, nuclear threats, those are largely the result of not resolving the underlying strategic issues. These tactical problems present a much more urgent threat for the United States. Feedback from the Russian members in the ELBA groups suggests that the Russian leadership is ready to work and talk about these tactical problems so that they can get to the underlying strategic problems. The U.S. and Russian ELBA group members discussed ISIS at our last October meeting, and the Russian group told the U.S. that the United States' primary, most dangerous threat to the United States is ISIS and religious extremism. They said everything else is a distraction, quote unquote. Well, the U.S. and Russian members did agree that the threat from ISIS is a common and dangerous threat, and that we should do everything we can to cooperate, which is even more than deconflict, against that threat. But the Russian assessment that ISIS is the main threat that faces us and everything else is a distraction is actually the opposite of what I believe. I believe that ISIS, although it is an urgent threat, is actually the distraction from the underlying, in terms of U.S.-Russia relationship, the distraction from the underlying and still festering problems for the U.S. and Russia. So the underlying strategic issues still remain. In Europe, especially the Baltics, this is where we see the threat of war for the United States from those underlying issues. Whereas in October, the Russians barely spoke about the Baltics or Ukraine. That was all they could talk about during the two previous meetings in March 2014 and March 2015. They made great argument then and outlined all the details to it that this region, the Baltics and Europe, is the region where our two countries face core U.S. and Russian interests. During those meetings, here are some of the things the Russian side said to the American colleagues about the Baltics and Ukraine. The U.S. is creating crises situations around the world to preserve its position as the #1 leader in the world. The U.S., the European bloc, and NATO are trying to dismantle the system of security that had existed in the European theater, and they named Yalta Conference as the model for that theory. Quote, "The biggest threat to Russia is U.S. activity along the borders of Russia," end quote. Russia sees the increasing presence of NATO military force in Eastern Europe, especially the Baltics, as a direct threat to Russian security and, quote unquote, won't tolerate it. And NATO should factor in the potential for Russia to increase its nuclear posture in response to any growth in NATO military presence. Finally, they see in the Baltics, these are their words, the same conditions that exist in the Ukraine and justify Russian actions there. And it's this standoff in the Baltics that most concerns the members of the Elba Group, both the US and Russian, when we think about scenarios that could lead to war. The situation in the Baltics is potentially the most dangerous threat to the United States, not because Russia or the US planned to go to war, but because an accident there could lead us to war. In the Baltics, as opposed to the Ukraine, both sides are committed to defend their interests. Russia because of its diaspora living in those countries and its borders, and the US because of its historical and NATO commitments to the Baltics. The buildup of the US-NATO military presence in the Baltics, along with Russia's own buildup along its border, increases the risk of an accidental clash along the borders, a shoot down of an American aircraft, injury to American troops, a ramming of a ship, etc. It's really not a question of if, but when. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union shot down 39 US aircraft along its borders. We don't think about that. Numerous ships were rammed. Soldiers were captured and held after crossing borders. Imagine such an incident today without the transparency that the long-standing Cold War constructs gave us. Our political leaders would be thrust into high-risk crisis decision situations. Unintended escalation could result, and because of our commitments in that region, those escalations could lead to war. So I'll close with just 4 short steps we need, I think, to take to avoid conflict with Russia over this region. First is to deter Russia in Eastern Europe. We need to continue doing the things we're doing there now. Increase troop presence. And by the way, even though the chairman said this is a priority for him, and the chief of staff of the Army, General Milley, said it's a priority for him, and Ash Carter has talked about it, and Philip Breedlove has said this is a #1 issue. The truth is that the money for this, these rotations, the funding and the backing of the United States government is slipping away on this issue. And we could very well find ourselves in another 2 years without the ability to actually do what all those generals are recommending. A second step is to establish communications between our militaries to give transparency on capabilities. And this goes with the next step, which is to establish communication between our intelligence agencies to give transparency on intent. US and Russian members both recommend that the two militaries establish mechanisms that allow each side to properly assess capabilities as well as diffuse crisis situations. We need to enable commanders on the ground to communicate to one another in a way that avoids combat or conflict. For example, the deconfliction that's already going on in Syria should be expanded to allow coordination, cooperation, whatever you want to call it, and that should be expanded to and applied to the Baltic region. And for the intelligence agencies, the Elba Group has been saying since its inception in 2010 that we should have open and constant communication between the intelligence and special services. And remember, these are not just academics or other people just wishing this. These are former heads of these agencies. The former GRU chief, General Korabelnikov, repeated this recommendation in October. And this past week, I noted in the press that CI Director John Brennan revealed he's been, in fact, talking to his counterpart, at least about ISIS and extremism, for the past year. I think this needs to be institutionalized in regular meetings. And finally, we need to engage Russia on these underlying strategic issues. Ballistic missile defense, strategic balance, deterrence in the post-Cold War, NATO-Russia relations, multilateral arms controls, all the things the United States does not want to talk to Russia about because, frankly, we lead in most of those things. So we don't want to have to be bothered trying to bring Russia up to speed. Until we begin to address these issues, we'll continue to battle pop-up tactical ones like Ukraine, et cetera, that we see now. So I'll stop there.
Great. Well, thanks very much. You guys have given us a lot to talk about. So I've got a lot of questions, but I'm going to start with, I think, sort of a broad one, and that is, I think all of the panelists agree that Russia is a major threat, but when asked about whether his foreign policy made Russia stronger, President Obama stressed the weaknesses of Russia, particularly its economic problems in light of U.S. and Western sanctions, the low price of oil, and other conditions. And so my question would be for all of you is Russia's threat to the United States and to the West a threat based on strength, structural strengths, military, economic, etc., or is it more a threat based on what one might characterize as a bold foreign policy, or another perspective might call reckless foreign policy? Is this just Vladimir Putin playing a weak hand, at least for the time being, well? And if it's the latter, how long can he sort of keep that up? And so perhaps we'll start.
Well, the economy is going through very hard times. As Paula mentioned, Alexei Kudrin actually made another prediction, which I found very startling, that for Russian economy, in its present state, meaning the only sector that's viable is commodity and oil and gas, for the Russian economy to grow substantially, and he meant 3 to 4% a year, the price of oil has to go up 7 to 10% a barrel every year. Now, that's a fairly dramatic condition for any economy to be tied to. But, you know, Western democracies are essentially based on a very simple proposition, at least after World War II. The standard of living has to grow, economy has to grow, and this is how we define prosperity and the national purpose. Well, this is a different regime. It does not require, at least for now, and I'll come to it, does not require economic growth. If the economic hardships are made palatable by a patriotic fervor, that essentially removes economy as a factor in foreign policy. Now, Putin is doing very smart things, though, on top of it. He's not committing enormous resources, either to Ukraine or to Syria. These are very limited engagements. I would like to continue with this metaphor, because in one of my articles I actually described Putin as, he's Russian, but he's not a chess player. He's what's known as judoka. Judo is his game. Now, what you do in judo is you watch your opponent very carefully, and you try to catch him off balance, or make him be off balance. And contrary to the popular stereotype, you don't win, usually in judo, by throwing your opponent on his back. You win by points. You see an opening, you see somebody off balance, there's points, there are half points. And you gradually accumulate with the lightning action, but not a particularly dramatic commitment of force. You're looking for balance, you're looking for weakness, you're looking for an opening. And that's what he's doing. So add to that, to the domestic political imperative, to the patriotic mobilization, and you'll see a very dangerous situation where the country, look, I mean, we know after the fall of the Soviet Union, again, I wrote a book about this, that the Soviet Union was a very poor country. I mean, by any standards. I mean, there's, any standard. It was a very poor country, or as the Russians used to say, it's a very poor country with a very rich state. In other words, by state, you see the apparatus and you see the secret police and the army. This is what Putin is replicating rather successfully.
To answer your question, I'd say several things. First, economically, Russia definitively is in dire straits. All of the data points to an economy that is going down. So in that context, there's a weakness. Politically, as I indicated, I would define Putin's power base as vertical, not across the board or horizontal, but vertical. Does that mean that he's not vulnerable? I would not necessarily say that, but I would say that he has done a lot to solidify his power base domestically. Thirdly, I think the adventurism and the aggression is a direct threat to us, and that's where we need to be concerned, because when you look at it, particularly with what's playing out not only in the European arena, but in the Middle East, the United States leadership has been challenged. We are not there, and it's been definitively challenged. Putin wants to definitively reestablish Russia as a great power. But what are the consequences for us? As I said in my comments, which I think is quite crucial here, there is a direct challenge to our alliance, to the NATO alliance. There's a direct challenge to the values that have unified us, and not just the West, but at large, the globe, the very structure and the institutions that we've had. He has, in his statements and his actions, put a direct threat and question forward. That affects us because this structure is what has held peace, security, and stability, and has protected our interests. So in that sense, I think when you're looking at Russia as a nuclear power and advancing that particular agenda, it is a direct threat to us. And it is something that we do need to be concerned about greatly.
I couldn't agree more. Seriously. It's the nibble, you know, if you take enough nibbles off a tiger, pretty soon there's a not very mobile tiger. And sending special operations people into Estonia to kidnap a senior police official and having us not even comment on it is exactly what you're talking about. That kind of nibble, push, and we don't do anything. And two things happen. The Russians look at us and say, these guys can't play serious ball. And our allies look at us and say, these guys can't play serious ball. Now if you start that crumbling of NATO, that will accelerate over time as prime ministers decide they don't want to go down, that could really be a problem, and you couldn't pull it back. You know, we knew that when Secretary Roosevelt started pulling brigades out of Germany, there's no place to go back to if you wanted to. So maybe you could get into a Polish training area called Drosko-Primorsky that's much bigger than anything we had in Germany. So, you know, winding these things back is really hard once it gets out from underfoot. And not many people know this, but U.S. Army Europe had the mission of training Russian units from about 2000 through 2003 and beyond. And you learn a lot when you're that close to people. You learn that some people drink vodka in the morning. It's hard to stay away from it because they're being good hosts. And you're supposed to operate, with your tanks full. But just to give you a sense of some of the animosities, and then I'll be quiet. We were also training Ukrainians. And when the army split up, if you were stationed in Ukraine and you wanted to stay in the Ukraine, you could. You became a member of the Ukrainian army. If you were a Russian that did that, and you didn't speak Ukrainian, you would never be promoted. And I befriended the Polish, we wound up as head of the army. At the time, he was a division commander. And whenever he talked about the Russians, he would just get angry. Really, really angry. That's another dynamic, because the people making the mistake could be an ally, and then what do you do? Over to you.
I'm just going to say, let's go to the next question. I think there have been great answers to that question. Yeah.
Let's take some questions from the audience. And I think there's a microphone that's going to go around. So let's sort of start on one end and go to the other, I guess. Is there anybody over here that has, since the microphone's over there? Let's start over here then. We've got a question here.
I'm interested that you have all characterized these threats in the Russian situation in terms of Putin. And I'm wondering, that seems a rather brittle characterization. The man is mortal. So I'd be interested in what you think what is a post-Putin threat? That is, as some of you indicated, he might not be able to withstand certain political pressures. And so I'd be interested in perhaps a larger view of the Russian threat.
So just to be clear, the word Putin is not in my text. So this is to the other people.
Anybody want to take that?
I can start. Putin is a dictator and a national hero. He matters. He matters for as long as he's there. I don't need to give you examples from history, both recent and distant. What's truly scary to me, and I'm sure my colleagues will address, strategic issues and political issues. What truly is scary here is that I don't think even, I spent first 24 years of my life in the Soviet Union. Even at that time, even in Brezhnev's Soviet Union, I don't remember this type of demoralization, literally, of a nation, as you're seeing now. People resented certain things. People dislike certain things. But there was some sort of institutional base. Much as, I don't have, an especially ardent love for the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, but it was an institution. From a tiny village in Siberia all the way to Moscow, there was a line of communication. The ministries, such as they were, worked, and again, you had a chain of command. You had some sort of institutional base. What worries my Russian colleagues, and I think you could look up on our website the book that I just edited of 9 top Russian independent political sociologists, Putin's Russia, how it arose, how it is maintained, and how it might end. The leitmotif, the kind of the red line, is that there's a massive deinstitutionalization of Russia. Any dictatorship, of course, has it, but there's also such a rampant corruption that not even a semblance of kind of any institutional structure, or I should say, an institutional structure has been eaten through. And once the man who has it, that vertical of power that Paul has been referring to, once he is removed, people make parallels with Stalin's death in 1953. Well, Stalin did have in place an institution called the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He had the government. Here, everything, whatever is not deinstitutionalized is eaten through by corruption. I strongly recommend, I don't think there's a better statement on this than a Russian nominee for this year's 2015 Oscar called Leviathan. Please see that movie. It's available. Get it on Netflix. Stream it. It portrays, it's a life in a small village in Russia, small town, somewhere along the shores of the White Sea, right? And for some of you who know Russian history, certainly for me, it struck me as if Russia was under some sort of a golden horde Mongol occupation in the 13th, 14th century. In other words, so long as you pay the tax to the Khan, to the power that be, you are left to do absolutely whatever you want in your town. And you see this triumvirate typical, my Russian friends are saying, of the mayor, the chief of police, and the judge. I'm sorry, four. The judge and the procurator, which is kind of almost like a federal attorney. The story is about essentially total lawlessness, but that lawlessness is based on this. Oh, by the way, there's also a Russian Orthodox Church, which is a very interesting situation here. In any case, Russia is a collection, and I spoke to some of my Russian friends from the opposition who travel Russia. Russia is a collection of these towns, which are totally autonomous, so long as they pay a very specific amount on the first of the month, and it goes up the chain. They're left totally alone to do whatever they want inside. This never happened even in the Soviet Union. So this, to me, is a very scary thing, because once Putin goes, and by the way, he stepped on the Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi elevator. He's a president for life. He either will die in office or be killed. There's no other exit for him. That is absolutely clear. That Russia, the sort of deinstitutionalized, kind of atomized, and completely corrupt, with 1,700 strategic nuclear warheads and almost 600 strategic nuclear launchers, meaning the silos, the submarines, and the bombers. That is the situation we never had before in history, and that is the thing that keeps me up at night.
I think Leon really well characterized how grave it is because of this personalization, centralization of power in such, a single person, and literally the dissembling of institutions, the economic deterioration, the demographic problems also, which are major, which Russia is confronted with. But let me take your question. I'm going to take it slightly in a different direction that he didn't address, but I think he well addressed what you asked. But let me expand it. One of the, I worked on a report on Russia for the Trilateral Commission. And I'd say one of the most heated discussions happened to be over what after Putin. Half of the group believed that there would be an opportunity if Putin was removed, meaning now, not down the road. If he was removed and he went by the wayside, that there would actually be an opportunity, and you wouldn't necessarily have to assume that it's going to be someone worse. That some argue that Russia has gone through different cyclical changes where there have been opportunities for liberalization. And that's why in my comment about also during this period, we need to ensure that we are reaching out to those who want to see reform, who want to see Russia modernized, and there are many of those in Russia today. Those are the people we should be engaging and reaching out to and encouraging them in that path. But it was interesting to me that one of the most heated arguments was whether after Putin it's going to be worse or it's going to be a moment of liberalization, and it was evenly divided. My own personal view is, I'd say historically, and actually the person here to my left was one of the people who made a very compelling case, that we've seen historical shifts that we can maximize on. So I wouldn't assume that it's going to be negative. It could be negative in the immediate term, but I think that there would be an opportunity for seizing well on a moment of liberalization in Russia. And I don't think Putin is invincible, as I said.
Let's take another question. Yeah, let's go over here.
Hi, thank you to all the panelists for being here. This is a very interesting talk. My question is, with respect to the Putin doctrine, is that a strategic kind of framework or more of a tactical decision-making tool for Putin? Maybe what does the timeline for success look like with respect to the Putin doctrine?
I'll jump out because I use the word Putinism and Leon used Putin doctrine. My own view is it's a combination. I think that actually, even though some have argued that they think that Putin is more ad hoc in his approach, I don't think so. That's why I went back looking at what he stated before the Munich Security Conference and then right up to the present. If you look at what he has said and then what he's followed up, you know, he's had a kind of strategic vision, or a vision which is also very much propelled by economic circumstances at home and his desire to solidify his power base. But at the same time, I think it's been tactical. Tactical because opportunities have opened up, and because he could do it. And so would it have been predicted that, all right, the action, the illegal annexation of Crimea, and then the aggression into Ukraine, would it have been absolutely predicted? I don't think so. Maybe I could be challenged on that, but I think there was a tactical opportunity, and he definitely took it. He was counting on a lack of unity in Europe, a lack of a response to taking those aggressive steps, and also even a lack of or kind of complacency of not standing up for what we have stood for, which was my point before. So I see it as a combination. I think that he will continue as long as he can. But that's why the earlier point, if we elevate the costs, I think that actually we would be able to push back what he's doing. And if there was unity of purpose in terms of us and the alliances that we have.
I think it's strategic, because if I come and hit you, not very hard, I just sort of hit you, you may just say, forget it. That's what we've been doing. There's some of these parries or thrusts that Putin makes. He's very careful. He looks at the scene. From what I've read, he's very analytical. He goes through it, pluses and minuses. What are the risks here? And then when the opportunity moves up, he's very quick. Look at how quickly he put forces down in Syria, without a lot of ramp-up time that you normally get to do that. I mean, they were out of the gate and they got there in a hurry, and it was a lot of heavy stuff. So I think you have to be very careful watching him play his game. Yep, he's a judo champ. He's also a chess player. And he will often take two moves while we're taking our one move, because he can shape the game that way. So if you're going to play with this guy, you have to be very, very cagey and know when to take a punch, to know when you've got an opening, and being able to recognize it. And that's the kind of intellectual approach I think you have to take with it.
Yeah, let's do another question. I think those are two good answers.
Let's take one in the back there. Oh, yeah.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here. I have a question. This is for all of the panelists, but it's based on Ambassador Dobriansky's comment. I'm wondering how you all feel about the issue of Russian propaganda. And I'm curious about your thoughts as to how this can be implemented from a U.S. foreign policy, as a U.S. foreign policy objective. So on the one hand, we have the U.S. institutions of the Voice of America and RFERL, which compared to Russian media obviously have not nearly as much funding. And then on the other hand, even if it did, would any amount of American-funded media be effective in Russia? Is that an appropriate use of an American institution? And if not, sort of what else can the U.S. government do as a foreign policy objective to sort of achieve something in this battle against Russian propaganda, which I think we all agree is a huge issue that really dominates this conversation?
Robert, let me say something about this. So I'm talking to the Russian Elba Group members. So in March 2014, we're meeting, Crimea has not yet been annexed, but we're meeting and we're watching on TV, shown up on the wall, news reports coming out of Crimea, and Americans and the Russians are at the meeting together. In the breaks, I'm putting up RTV or anybody else, CNN or whatever. And we're both watching the same exact thing on the wall, and we cannot agree about what we're seeing. Okay, good propaganda tells you something you're already predisposed to believe. bad propaganda is, I tell you that it's noontime right now. You're not going to believe that. But if I tell you it's actually 6:45, you might believe that, even if it's not true. What's happening in Russia today, and we'll talk about the security elites, is that I don't see any gap between what they believe and what the media is putting out in Russia in general. Some minor changes here and there. But you had people like General Karbelnikov, former head of the GRU, world traveler, internet, he has all the analysts in the world. He still has an office in the MOD. He has all the analysts with all the connections from all over the world, and he can sit there and tell us things like most of those things I read off to you about the U.S. is creating crises around the world. The U.S. created the Arab Spring. The U.S. created the Maidan insurrection. He's saying these things because he believes them. And so you and I might say, well, that's just a product of propaganda. I don't think so. I think there is already a predisposition to believe 99% of what we're hearing over our TV. That's my 2 cents on it.
I'll jump in. I see it a little differently. Right now, with Russia's involvement in Syria and its actions in Syria, it's interesting to me first that the polling, the press in Russia has diverted so much, obviously, from what was playing out in Europe. There's a diversion of the attention relevant to Ukraine, and to anything Europe related. Sanctions, by the way, are going to be examined and revisited in Europe at the end of December. But it's all about the actions, the glorious actions being taken, in Syria. But let me give an example where I have to question, the issue about one's belief. When you look at particularly the propaganda that's coming out, let's take Putin himself. He has done a number of interviews which heretofore, up to the present time, he denied that there have been any Russian troops or military hardware in Ukraine. He says it over and over and over, and it wasn't only till just recently. Now, the reason why, fundamentally, was because he knows his population, if they knew that there have been soldiers carried out in body bags, that actually is quite problematic for him. So I would say that they've been, in my view, very adept. I'm not sure that everyone believes everything. If you've seen it over and over, there might be some in the government, and they're part of that apparatus. But I'm going to give one more. I happened to be in Greece, right? And I turned on RT. And what did I see? I actually saw a video, and the video was about the National Endowment for Democracy. I don't know how many of you know the National Endowment for Democracy, but it was created in the Reagan administration. Well, what they did is they had actually an American, not a Russian, an American, a professor from I don't remember where, in Middle America, who was condemning the president of the National Endowment for Democracy, saying that he was misusing funds, that he was doing this, he was doing that. I have to tell you, when you look at it, to me, it's absolute propaganda, and it has had an influence, particularly when you look at the political change in Europe. I think that Russia has been using it quite effectively, and people don't know what to believe. Ukrainians, on the issue of who came in, the little green men, in uniform, again, who were these people? What were they doing there and suddenly appearing? It is one of the areas that we are very weak on, and it's not just about the radios. It really is about stepping back and looking at a more robust strategy to counter a very adept apparatus.
If I could just add a little bit. It's funny, I testified on that issue before the U.S. Senate 3 weeks ago, and I would like to just make the same disclaimer that I'm speaking here as a private expert, not as a governor of the Broadcasting Board of Governors appointed by the president. and Broadcasting Board of Governors is the organization that supervises all those radios. It's a fascinating issue. Let me give you just one example. Well, I was in Kiev in May on the fact-finding mission for Broadcasting Board of Governors, and one of the most fascinating meetings I had was with a professor of journalism at the Kiev Mohila Academy, which is probably the best known and the best institution of higher learning in Ukraine. He and his students started a website which you could check out called stopfake.com, and you'll find all sorts of examples there of the Russian propaganda. His favorite, and actually mine too, was the reporting straight face in the Russian media that President Obama had extended up to year 2020 the ban on Russian balalaikas in the United States. It's a mandolin type instrument, which is a Russian national instrument. I will not. This is funny, but I will not. But there are really gruesome examples as well that you could find there. I could give you one personal example where I've been researching the recruitment of the Russian nationals by ISIS, and it's a separate issue, by the way. Russia is the largest Muslim country in Europe now, outside Turkey, and Moscow is the largest Muslim capital in Europe, outside of Ankara and Istanbul, and we can talk about this. I think Putin is sincerely afraid of ISIS because at least 2,400 Russian nationals, just from Russia alone, from the former Soviet Union, it's between 5,000 and 7,000. Just to give you a comparison, the largest contingent, a European contingent in ISIS, is from France, and it's 1,200. So it's a fascinating issue that I've been researching for quite a while. We can talk about it later. But the point is that I've been researching Russian media, looking for articles on this. And indeed, I was in the Russian search engine called Yandex. I was indeed directed to a website with some pretty interesting articles. But what do I see on top of the page? I see a cartoonish Uncle Sam with a baby dressed in the ISIS uniform, black and white uniform, sitting with a Kalashnikov, just in case, the machine gun, so that you don't make any mistakes as who that is. And it's written under it in Russian, of course, ISIS, the creation of the American two-party system. By the way, I don't know, sir, I don't know if you're Russian, Korabelnikov and others. It is an article of faith that the United States created ISIS.
Yeah, that's my point. Is not that they're not saying these things. The point is that the people are believing them. So you and I laugh about it as propaganda. To them, it's reality.
So this is the situation. And again, remember monopolistic media. Yes, there's internet. Yes, 10% who hate Putin anyway. Yes, they take their news from the internet. 95% of the Russians take it from the television. And these are the sorts of things they see, and these are the sort of things they're fed. It's a very dangerous situation. RT which is Russia Today, is annoying. However, RT is, that it does not broadcast in Russian, and it does not ever identify itself as a Russian station. Where things are really dangerous is what we call the weaponization of propaganda, and that is not RT, but what the Russian media broadcasts into the former Soviet Union. I was in Moldova, and Ukraine for that matter too, but Moldova particularly vulnerable, and of course, Central Asian countries. They say it's much cheaper to just get the Russian news than produce your own. And in Ukraine, they're trying to resist because there's a sizable population, which brings me to Radio Liberty, Radio for Europe, some of our, as we call them, grantees of the Broadcasting Board of Governors. I was amazed by the amount of admiration and respect
that people and elites as well of those countries, Ukraine and Moldova, had for Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe. And it's not just abstract respect. We actually were present, and I can't disclose to you which stations. There were several Ukrainian top networks that were vying for particular programs by Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe. Why? Because objectivity and telling it, they still believe for the most part that this is straight journalism. And in Ukraine, it's not just the Russian propaganda. It's every oligarch has its own channel. And they're tired of it. The population hungers for unadulterated news. So this is our greatest cachet. We don't need to compete, and we can't compete with Putin in the amount of allocated for propaganda. And God forbid we don't want to broadcast propaganda. There are two-pronged way to deal with it. One is continue to respect and project journalistic integrity, as Radio Liberty, Radio Free, and all other radios, Marti and all kinds of other radios project. And secondly, support through National Endowment for Democracy, through other institutions, and maybe with some grants from the US government, the civic groups, the civil society groups, such as StopFake.com, that will spread sort of a counter, kind of something that would make the Russian propaganda less effective. There is no fast and hard way to do it. It's very ugly, but I think, listen, we survived the Cold War. The Russian propaganda was very good at that time too, because people believed that there is a multitude of sources. For post-Soviet countries, the real weakness is the absence of the multitude of conflicting sources. They have Russian news and they have their state news, and the choice is not particularly.
Leon, can I just draw you out on one
I'm
part
done.
of that?
Yeah. Sorry for this long monologue.
If ISIS is such a problem for the Russians, particularly in the Caucasus, who may not want to go down this road because of the way they were burnt out by Putin, if that's really a serious problem for them, it's a serious problem for NATO, why is it not difficult to get some sort of a communications thing so that, where it's not in the propaganda realm, don't put the intel guys in there because they can't say anything. And I don't mean that pejoratively. If you're a Russian intel guy and you're off talking about things, you're in trouble. American too. But there ought to be a way of cross-coordinating critical operational information that's good for both sides. Why can't we establish something like that on this ISIT gig?
You want me to answer this?
Well, I be quick because we're on someone else's time.
I'll have to be very quick, and I'm sure others will. The problem is, it's funny. I just finished a piece which tomorrow will be on CNN.com about that very problem. Putin comes to the UN and he says, ISIS is an issue and we all have to fight ISIS. Then he gives an interview on the Russian television 3 weeks ago and he says, we are in Syria primarily to support the legitimate government of Syria, which is Assad. As you know, he bombs primarily the Western-supported forces who are most effective in fighting Assad, by the way. So there are all kinds of issues involved in Putin's presence in Syria that are inimical to our goals. So this is, I'm all for cooperation with that. But remember, Putin is looking for very specific issues. He's looking for establishing a foothold, recovering the asset that was lost. Russia's only port in the Mediterranean, and now the only base there in the Middle East. But he's also looking, from this alliance, he looks for all kinds of other things. He's looking for another Yalta. As Paula mentioned, you don't sanction your allies, right? So let's take the sanctions away. And there is one thing that I wrote down when we were talking about this. That means that you have also summits with Western leaders, and particularly the American president. And make no mistake about it, America is the only country that counts for Russia. When chips are down, it's a very interesting love-hate relationship, but it's the only country they respect. And every time they meet with the American president, and that, by the way, was true in the Soviet days, it's a huge shot in the arm to the present Russian leader. So try to share communications, try to have some sort of alliance with Putin, but remember that his goals in Syria diverge quite substantially.
Sure.
And whether we could bridge that gap is a big question.
So, I don't know, I think we're getting close to time, but we'll have one more question. So, let's go right here.
Sir, thanks. I think you might be able to hear me. And Leon, you just touched on it. I thought we might be able to get a little bit more perspective. I think there's broad agreement with the panel of the huge economic challenges in Russia, and certainly the existential threat. But I would be interested in the perspective of the panel, not only of Russia's involvement and dialogue with Iran, particularly as it pertains to the current and what is foreseen as the future of the Assad regime.
Russia and Iran.
I'll start. Okay, so to simplify, and many people here may already understand this, but the extremist, the Islamic extremist threat to Russia is Sunni. It's entirely Sunni in their Caucasus. So the Shia Iranian state is a natural ally for them against this Sunni threat. The Alawites are not Sunni. They're not technically Shia, but they're at least not Sunni. And so they are a natural ally against this threat. And this is a guiding principle for Russian strategy and policy toward Iran and toward the Syrian regime. That is my 2-cent version.
I'll add two things quickly to that. The previous question from the young man about Putin's strategic goals, or are they tactical? I think Kevin very well described, where Russia's coming from. But I'd also add to that I think that part of its calculation is also where is the United States? And juxtaposing and looking at this chessboard of what can we do which goes really in it gives the opposite or impact for the United States. In other words, what can we do to really go up against U.S. interests? And in this case, I think that what we've witnessed in Iran, and just not only with the nuclear deal, but also obviously the Russian, right immediately, the selling, of hardware, right just comes right in our faces. But it's even the broader Middle East. Leon wrote about how Russia has such a stake in Assad, and we were discussing before we sat down. I said to him, definitely, but Assad is expendable. It's more about Syria and their port access and their place in the Middle East. So they look at the Middle East overall. I think they're looking at the Middle East, and Putin's looking at the Middle East through the prism of what kinds of steps can be taken that are going to undermine not only U.S. interests, but also the United States' influence in the region. And then thirdly, I do see this also connected to what's playing out in Europe, and that is that this is a real diversion from the outright aggression that took place in Ukraine.
Just 2 words. There is a flip side to the alliance with Iran, precisely because most Russian citizens are Sunnis, and precisely because most Central Asians are Sunnis. And as you know, Russia now has between 5 and 6.5 million Central Asians, migrants, who are rapidly radicalizing. There are between 300 and 500 recruiters for ISIS in Moscow, and the secretary of the Russian National Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev, admitted recently that there's nothing they can do to stem the flow of volunteers. The Russian language is the third most popular language of ISIS after Arabic and English. There's Russian graffiti that you could see on the internet. In Syria, one of them says, "We will pray in your palace, Putin." So this is an extremely dangerous situation for Russia, allying itself with Shiites against the overwhelming majority of the Russian population. And by the way, the main threat is no longer from North Caucasus. It's from Central Asia and from the Russian native, or I should say long-term Muslim people, such as Tatars and Bashkirs. There's 1 million Chechens, and there are 5 million Tatars and 1.2 million Bashkirs in Russia. It's a very dangerous situation, and it could be one of those cases where Putin miscalculated hugely.
Well, let's close there. Thank you very much, folks.
All right, thus concludes our opening session. We will resume here tomorrow morning in the same room at 8:30 a.m. for a fascinating panel on what to do about failed states and stabilizing them. And then for the conference speakers, we've got a shuttle for your dinner right up front on the lower level. So waiting for you now.